Hello and welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick. And in this video, I'm going to be discussing upon the request of multiple viewers of the channel, the writing and the work of economist Gail Tverberg and her blog Our Finite World. And her basic thesis is really, she kind of goes into the connection between energy access and the economy. And her thesis is basically goes like this, and if I'm wrong, feel free to clarify me. But the way that you can grow is with energy beyond the capacity of an individual human. Like our most primitive societies, the only power that we could have to move things and produce stuff was through manpower, like physical human labor. Eventually, as society got more advanced, we were able to use machinery to make human labor more efficient and domesticate animals who have more, I guess in a literal and a figurative way, horsepower to keep the world moving in terms of shipping goods or construction or other plowing fields, etc. Allow the society to get progressively more advanced machines that make the power of human labor and animal labor more efficient. Then with the Industrial Revolution, you came the use of non-biological muscle to produce things, such first was water mills in Industrial Revolution England and windmills in the Netherlands, and it has branched off with the discovery of coal and using coal fire to power trains and to power factories, and then it evolved in electricity once that got invented, and then it became crude oil and natural gas, which are the primarily fossil fuels of today. And basically the cheaper energy has gotten, standard of living has basically correlated with the affordability of energy and the more available energy used to produce things or to ship goods and services and people around. And Earth theory is that due to limits in this availability of affordable energy, the economy will stagnate and economic growth will disappear. And this partially goes into the peak oil thesis, where peak oil was the idea that was really common in the early 2000s, where due to no new conventional oil drilling sites being discovered or not being discovered at fast enough a pace, but the world's oil supply was going to peak in the year 2007, I believe, and it did peak in the early 70s in the U.S. because all of the opportunities of easily accessible oil through straight down drills, whether offshore or on the land, were tapped by the early 70s, or at least they started pumping out. And then basically the way to keep oil supply growing globally was to expand to other countries, and that's why OPEC became as powerful as it was, because they had all the cards, because those countries, the exporters, were the places where you needed to drill for extra oil. And so as a derivative of that same trend that happened in the US in the 70s was going to expire in the mid-2000s. And what they underestimated, what really blew the peak oil thesis, was the invention and the increasing affordability of horizontal fracking. And this new way of drilling is basically magnified the supply of the energy market, not just in the US but globally. And the rest of the world is like what happened with the US in the 50s or 60s. Like, there's still plenty of Fracking, due to its political environmental controversies and just the immense amount of cost there is to implement it originally compared to an environment of expertise, geological expertise, compared to just a traditional well, we're still at the early stages internationally. With the U.S., you're getting closer to maxing it out, but oil production pre-COVID was continuing just to make new records every year, and it got to the point where even we got rid of the ban on oil exports because America became a net oil producer and natural gas producer. And so what the peak oil people got wrong is they underestimated innovation, and that's why you had the big oil bust from 2014 to 2020, essentially, with a few hiccups up along the way, was because all this supply came on the market and oil demand actually peaked, not supply, when the peak oil people thought it was. Like, developed market oil demand, the US and Europe and Japan, peaked in 2005. The only growth in oil demand globally is in emerging market countries where people still are transitioning from bikes and horse and buggies to everybody driving cars and having air conditioning and electricity and all that. And as the global population stabilizes, that'll eventually stabilize the demand for oil. So where Gail has it is that, and a lot of other energy people would counter my argument on this part, is that fracking costs a lot more than traditional oil drilling does. And yeah, that is true. But at the same time, if you look at the real cost of oil, adjusted for inflation, we're nowhere near all-time highs. We're well below where it was in 2007, and I'll show a chart in this video with that. And it's down more, actually. Oil was $140 a barrel at its peak in 2008. We're in a little bit above that. Oil is now trading in the low 70s. We're down 50% in nominal terms, and the CPI over that period of time is up about 50%. So in real terms, oil is well below half the price it was at its peak. So it's close to its historical inflation-adjusted average. So a lot of of course, they increase your cost, but again, with the productivity of technology, the expensive drilling can be factored in just with inflation. So the question really is not really ever running out of oil, period, because there will be technological solutions to be able to drill fossil fuels or natural gas in a more efficient way. But the real risk, which I think that Gail Tverberg is kind of more referring to now, is we're going to run out of cheap oil. Because, okay, maybe there's a new, even more modern way to extract harder to get oil, or a way to do fracking, say, offshore in the deep ocean or something. It's probably going to cost quite a bit. Pre-2014, a lot of the frackers claimed their break-evens were $70, $80, $90 a barrel. Now they've been able to improve their techniques to get those break-evens a lot lower. But if those sources run out, you're going to have to go back again to countries that will have to charge a high tax, oil exporting countries, to pay for social safety nets, such as the Gulf states, or another future big fracking country may actually be Argentina, and they have political problems and probably would need to charge a pretty big tax to help give themselves international credibility in the bond market. So and Russia is also going to be a potential big source for fracking in the future. And yeah, these governments have pretty low taxation, and they rely on oil revenue as compensation, and so they need a much higher base price, and they'll probably have a significant royalty attached to it before exporting into the global market. So the argument really here is that energy prices will become too high to grow an economy. And you'll get stagnation because if all of the productivity of society is used just to fuel the energy needs, there's not room for anything else. There's no room to invest in innovation or education or consumers having disposable income to spend and circulate money into the economy. That's her core argument, that because the oil supply is probably much more scarce, even with fracking, than the consensus wants to believe, that energy shortage is more pronounced. Given the average age of my audience and how visionary and strong their critical thinking skills are, I bet the first question really came, well, what about green energy? What about renewables? Where do they fit in this? If you have enough renewable energy, why do we have to worry about this oil supply issue and natural gas? Well, I mean, there is a role for alternative energy. The question really is that at what price do oil and natural gas have to get for those to be fully competitive? And it's difficult to measure that because solar and wind farms are heavily subsidized by governments, and so you gotta pay for those subsidies one way or the other, which goes into the total cost of society, which is what our finite world argument is concerned about. Not necessarily about like what's the direct cost of me charging a Tesla versus having to fill up a tank of gas at a gas station, because those may be the same cost, or the electric may be cheaper just on a direct-to-consumer pricing, but the cost of securing the alternative energy through government taxes and subsidies and other things like that create a different net picture. And also the cost of battery construction and storage. Like solar in warmer weather climates is doing a good job replacing a lot of the energy grid. And the problem is the batteries and the lack of energy. Really, when you see it, they call it the duck curve problem, where you have a lot of energy available during the day, but you have less at night, and you have the least amount in the 4 to 9 p.m. time, which is peak use time, because it's also when the sun's not as strong. And if you have a cloudy day, it affects things too. And then there's the cost of replacing and repairing these panels, whose shelf life varies. So you do have renewable energy, and same with wind too. It's the same, a lot of similar issues in terms of climate requirements and efficiency being less than fossil fuels. Especially on an energy density basis, both wind and solar are considerably less efficient. And without subsidies, for wind and solar to be competitive, natural gas would have to triple from here, and possibly more. Probably have to be in real terms like the 2007 highs. And natural gas is so cheap right now, which is why part of the reason the U.S. economy has been able to continue to grow and outperform a lot of other parts of the world is because we have cheaper energy costs. And it's also why manufacturing is starting to onshore. There are other geopolitical and economic reasons for that, but to make the cost comparison even remotely competitive to emerging market economies, whereas they have lower labor costs, the U.S. has much lower energy costs to help balance that out. So what do I think about our finite world? Yeah, I think that could be an issue if innovation in energy extraction techniques or the political will just changes, that they just simply don't allow it. You can get her supply shortage not from a legitimate just running out of fossil fuel, because I just think that's highly unlikely due to the ability for innovations to continue to be more efficient in extracting resources, and demand peaking a lot faster than I think Gail Tverberg would believe it would be. I mean, it's already, energy demand and oil demand has already peaked in the developed economy 15 years ago. And in the emerging economy, especially if birth rates continue to fall faster than consensus expects, you could see the global peak demand come off a lot sooner. It's going to be, I think, my opinion, well before 2050 when energy demand peaks. So if we cannot keep up supply between that time period and renewables do not get more efficient, then yeah, she'd be right. But I think that the main critique I have of her argument is that either renewables get more efficient to cover it, or technology and extraction gets better at a low enough of a cost to not fully derail the economy until oil demand and energy demand peaks mid-century. I mean, she's essentially betting against innovation to fix the energy problem, which I think, given the ability of humans to innovate, and especially in a more collaborative digital world, which makes the exchange of ideas a lot easier, is a bad bet to make in the long term. Yeah, that's kind of my bottom line conclusion on this. So you did see, you could have spurts where the peak oil crowd looks right, and that was 2000 to 2007, was a combination of fracking technology not being ready yet, alternatives being a lot more expensive than they are now, and a sudden surge in energy demand through China and the BRICS countries fully entering the global marketplace and bring their people's living standards above abject poverty. It was the perfect cocktail to have a major spike in energy markets. Where she does get things right, though, is that higher energy prices are bad for economies, and usually economic cycles peak with a big oil spike. It happened in 2007, 2008. It happened shortly before the pandemic. It happened in the 70s and late 60s. Because if that money has to be spent on oil and oil exporter countries, then that money cannot be spent in other parts of the economy, and that creates a recession because there's higher net imports, especially this is back when the U.S. was a net importer of energy, and nothing to replace that in the domestic market, and less income to be spent at home in the domestic market. The other thing that's changed too is that high energy prices are not necessarily bad for the United States anymore. Why are they not necessarily bad? Because the U.S. is not a major oil importer. Like during the Bush years, the U.S. was the biggest oil importer in the world and was for a long time, and that's made us victim to a lot of what was going on in oil exporting countries from a geopolitical perspective, and was a major drag on the economy and the trade deficit. But now with domestic production of both oil and natural gas to the point that we can export, the energy industry and a lot of the people who are employed, if you look at the Houston metropolitan area, would benefit greatly from higher oil prices, whereas the drawbacks aren't as bad because of that money, instead of being shipped to spend on oil exports and enriching OPEC country members or sheiks in the Middle East, that is instead going to oil producers at home, and those people earn incomes and spend it domestically. So it's not the same negative trade-off anymore. I think in certain countries that are heavily net oil importers and do not produce their own energy, like China and Japan and Korea, I think Gail's problem is way more relevant, and they also have the same problem with food and not being able to produce enough without the international market support. So I think she is right in places that are net energy scarce. And Europe also may have this, but they do have LNG technology that makes it help that other markets other than Russia and Qatar can supply their energy because they could ship it through, because these new markets ship it through LNG terminals versus having to rely on pipelines to connect the energy sources. So my view is, I think her view is kind of a little bit short innovation, and it is valid, but I think that I'm optimistic enough in humanity that it will not work on the long term. I mean, could it work if we have another inflationary scare in the early 2020s and commodities overall get bid and the transition costs of relocating supply chains require some extra energy to get set up? Yeah, I think you could see a run here or there. It's difficult to time those, but you could see like a bull run in energy. We've had a great bull run in energy from when it was trading at negative last April to the present. But do I see it sustainably trading at a level that would cripple the economy and prevent long-term structural growth? No. And I think there's plenty of other reasons to be bearish on growth if you want to be bearish on economic growth. I just don't think energy is that answer. Thanks for watching, and if you like this content, feel free to like or subscribe to our channel, and feel free to send any suggestions to askafundmanager@gmail.com or write in the comments on this video or others. Have a good evening, and thank you for watching.